Okay, thanks. So it's my great honour to welcome Dr. John Anderson, who we met online actually through the Institute of Psychedelic Therapy. I reached out to you and we've been corresponding. Yeah, particularly because your interest, my interest, I was talking before about psychedelics and psychosis. And John, didn't talk about that today, but it's a personal experience of diagnosis of bipolar, numerous admissions to hospital with psychosis, and felt, yeah, more or less cured your condition with psilocybin, but maybe you want to talk a little bit about, but that's not the thrust of the talk today. And despite all that stuff you've been through with that, you are a cognitive neuroscientist. You're currently at Cambridge University, where you're the course director for a degree in cognitive psychology. You're an integrative humanistic counsellor, and so you teach some counselling, is that right, as well as private practice, and you do a lot of work for with people doing psychedelic integration work. Yeah. Great, thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. All right, so I'll just talk a few minutes about my kind of personal story, just to kind of anchor things, and then I'll get into the substance of my talk. So some of you will be familiar with my personal story, having seen the documentary which I took part in for Drug Reporter, which you can find on YouTube. So where to start? So I was diagnosed with bipolar when I was 28, after the first episode of psychosis, during which I attempted to end my life twice. I recovered from that initial episode, and then for the years subsequent to that, I had episodes of mania, crippling depression, and sometimes psychosis to some degree, pretty much every year from that point. And when I got to my 40s, having been on medication for quite some time, with all of the side effects that brought, I think I got to the point where I just couldn't see a future for myself anymore. And I remember walking home from the local shops, and I lived quite near a train line. And I thought, that's it, I'm going to check out. I went and put my head on the railway line, put my neck on the line, and just waited for the train to come along. And there was some part of me remembered the early stage trial for depression that David Nutt's team had done with psilocybin at Imperial. And I thought to myself, why don't I try this? My background was in neuroscience at the time. So I thought, well, if death is what's facing you, what do I have to lose, really? So I tried that, and it changed my life. And to give you an idea as to how bad things were for me at that time, a little knowledge can be a dangerous thing. So at the time, I was really, really depressed. And I thought, why don't I give myself some homemade ECT to try and bounce myself out of the depression? So I shaved off all my hair. I bought off the internet a bunch of muscle stimulators, you know, these type that give you like super abs type thing. Fitted as many of them on as I could onto my head, whacked up the power, full blast on each of them. So I remember I sat against the bath in the bathroom, and every few seconds I'd go. At some point, the batteries ran out. I don't think I was awake at the time. I woke up, all the batteries were dead, and I had big red spots on my head. I actually did feel a bit better from that, but I don't recommend anybody try it. That's how bad things got. And my beautiful wife was understandably very distressed. She'd been with me for many years through various episodes of illness. And psychedelics really changed that whole picture for me. I stopped having episodes of psychosis, which, as you can imagine, was life transformative in itself. I also discovered my intention to train as a therapist myself from one of my early psychedelic journeys, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So since that point, I've been very healthy, not had any major episodes of depression. Do I still get a bit hypomanic and depressed? Yes, I do, very much. But I am able to navigate those much more healthily now, and they never get to the point where I feel destabilized. So for those of you that know my personal experience, I was raped at knife point when I was 11 years old. And that is what one of the traumas that I experienced that led to me eventually getting to the train tracks and trying to end my life. I tried numerous forms of therapy over the years. None of it had kind of really had the beneficial impact on me that psilocybin had had. So it's no understatement to say that that completely changed my life. And if it wasn't for that, I would not be here now, which is why on a personal level, I really struggle to see how people with a diagnosis of bipolar 1, which is what I have, are not able to access therapy, this type of therapy, which could be life transformative. Although I do, of course, recognize that it is no easy challenge to be able to provide the dedicated psychological support that one would need to be able to navigate those states in a way that reduces the risk as much as possible. So that's kind of a little introduction to me as a person. I train therapists. I also in the process of developing my own counselor training pathway for working with altered states of consciousness, so psychedelic practitioner training. And it's that process and some of the challenges that I've experienced that I'm going to talk to you about today. So if anybody has any questions that they want to ask me, either related to the talk or my personal story, happy to talk about that later. All right, so let's get into it. So I'm going to kind of read from my notes in part here because some of this information is quite dense. So I want to make sure that I get it all across. So let's think a little bit about what the role of a psychedelic practitioner is. So in the broadest possible terms, the role of a psychedelic practitioner is to support people who are experiencing an altered state of consciousness, occasioned through the use of a psychedelic. So this could be a classic psychedelic or a non-classic, in the case of ketamine, but also increasingly in pathogens such as MDMA. Practitioners are expected to work with people in a very relational way, and they do so by working through 3 primary stages, which you can summarize as being preparation, facilitation of the acute experience, and then the aftercare or the integration. I sometimes think that kind of aftercare is a more useful term than integration, because often the term integration gets a bit confused with integrative therapist practice, which I know is one of the things that the ACP has got a bit of a bee in its bonnet about. So within the practitioner role itself, you can say that it actually intersects with many different areas. So you're kind of, as a psychedelic practitioner, you may be working to a psychotherapeutic framework, a medical framework, a psychospiritual framework, and really there are elements of all of those things, and including a broadened horizon of philosophy, and all of those things coming to and intersect the role of a psychedelic practitioner. So you also see this complexity in the current professional context in which this type of work takes place. So in the UK, and it's primarily going to be talking about the UK situation today in terms of the therapist training, is that you have...
Just need to start sharing the screen for the online people.
Okay, cool. So you have ketamine clinics. Currently in the UK, you also have private practice where the active facilitation takes place in a country where it's legal to do that. You also have the research environment. And I think that there's a kind of generally an inadequate focus is given to exploring the roles and the limitations of the psychedelic practitioner in those different contexts with respect to things like, what the limitations are in each setting and what the different ethical challenges arise across those different working environments are. And to a certain extent, we do that sort of thing in counselling, where you would have the role of the counsellor, but you would examine in different professional contexts what the limitations and ethical challenges would be. And I think this is actually a really useful way forward for psychedelic practitioner training. So one thing that I would like to kind of leave as an open question at this point is to think about, in terms of the courses that are currently available within the UK, and there are a number of different courses. The courses are sometimes run by universities. You have one here. It's not a practitioner training course, but it is nonetheless giving people the kind of knowledge base that would be very useful in that type of context. We have private companies that are increasingly getting into the training market, primarily serving their clinical trials process. We also have a demand for therapists working in research environments within universities. So across all of these different domains, you could expect there to be some really interesting professional opportunities that are opening up for practitioners. The downside is that there's also a lot of companies who wanted to get in on the training market, and one is left with the question of, are actually any of these training courses for practitioners actually worth the often extortionate amounts of money that is charged for them? So I'll just kind of leave that question with you. And what I'd like to talk about in this presentation is some of the challenges, some of the issues that I think are facing the training field right now. And importantly, looking at ways that as a sector, we can pull together to try to address them. Because if we don't, people are going to get hurt. So I'll kind of frame the discussion around two main areas. So I'll look to start with the kind of target audience, the goals and the objectives of the training. And then I'll kind of switch track a little bit and look at specific issues that exist right now in psychedelic practitioner training. All right, so goals reflect in many respects the broad statements that define the desired outcome of the particular training program. So there's, of course, with psychedelic practitioner training, there's no one size fits all. And basically, I think it's important for people who are thinking of embarking on that training process to really look at what the goals of the training program are, because those goals will probably tell you how they've actually articulated the role of the psychedelic practitioner. So it's important, I think, that people choose a course that's right for them, that's going to fit where they want to be in the future. Now, my own experience of therapist training was very positively impacted and deeply impacted by my own psychedelic experiences, but I often felt very frustrated that I wasn't able to integrate into my therapist training program the insights and the experiences that I was having in parallel with my psychedelic experiences. And I felt that in many ways, that was something that I really wanted to change for the future. So after a few years, basically, after I qualified, getting much more experience as a therapist and working as an psychedelic integration therapist, I decided to start thinking about how to actually design a therapist training program for those people who wanted to specialize as psychedelic practitioners. So within that, I would, those three stages, as I said earlier, there will be some people who will only work on the preparation and the integration. whereas there will be other people who will want to work through the whole each of those 3 stages, depending on their particular circumstances. So it's thinking about a training process that allows people to gradually develop those skills over a period of time. The advantage of this framework is that it provides a very structured training process and uses the teaching methods that have been proven to work in traditional therapist training programs. These are tried and tested methods. We know they work, and I think that there is something that we can learn from that process for working with psychedelic states. So to my knowledge, there's no other therapist training program currently on offer in the UK which would do this. I'm sure there will be other ones in the future, and actually variation and variety, I think, is entirely a good thing. But right now, it seems to be, to my knowledge, only me developing this process. So my target audience in this sense was basically those people who want to train as therapists, but they know from the outset that they want to do that, specialize in the modality of training as a psychedelic practitioner. So when I think about how you would actually structure that, actually we'll get to that in the next slide. Jump ahead of myself. So then you think about the objectives. So the objectives are very simply those things which are measurable and actionable statements which are related to your goals. So basically, you would break those objectives down into specific learning criteria that students would then encounter. They would need to be able to demonstrate those criteria and evidence that they've done so. And they would need to do that by the end of the training program. So the training program duration varies depending on the training. So for therapist training processes, by the time you've taken into consideration different courses, you're talking as a minimum probably a 3-year period. If you measure that against the average psychedelic practitioner training, which can range from maybe 3 to 6 months, or maybe a 12-month, and then that's it, you're kind of deemed to be good to go. For various reasons that we'll come to in a bit, I think that's deeply problematic. So well-structured training programs have objectives, as I say, broken down into specific learning outcomes. And in considering these in relation to psychedelic practitioner training, it felt to me that a kind of vocational training process was going to make more sense, because here you have the opportunity to kind of combine theory with practical application. And the important thing is that often vocational qualifications tend to be very popular with employers, because they know that the people that are coming through the process have a very structured process where they can easily demonstrate what skills and knowledge they've acquired. So I decided to base my training on a therapist training program that was vocational, so basically a diploma structure. So let's think a little bit more then about the kind of target audience goals and objectives. So across the different contexts within which psychedelic practice occurs, there is an increasing need actually for fully trained therapists and coaches who can provide high quality psychological support to participants in research trials, but also clients if they're working in a private clinic setting, or if they're a private practitioner doing facilitation work, say in the Netherlands or a country where it's legal to do that. However, within the different training programs that are currently available in the UK, I would say learning outcomes vary very considerably. And one of the primary issues that I've come across is that unlike other professions such as counseling, psychotherapy, and coaching, currently there are no commonly agreed standards for practice and education. So right now, the training sector is a bit of a kind of Wild West scenario. So we're seeing a large variation in practices. Some courses don't have clearly defined objectives and learning criteria. Some courses, it's not clear how students are being assessed, and are therefore able to demonstrate skills. Now, Phelps in 2017 suggested 6 core competencies. I don't know whether any of you have come across these, but I'll just go through them quickly, that he said could be incorporated into psychedelic practitioner training for therapists. And these relate to empathic, imbibing presence, trust enhancement, spiritual intelligence, knowledge of the physical and psychological effects of psychedelics, therapist self-awareness, and ethical integrity. We need a lot of that these days. And proficiency in complementary techniques. So complementary techniques might be things like meditation, breath work, all of those sorts of, and ways to kind of ground people would be classed as complementary techniques. And many of these competencies can be actually gained through a counseling and psychotherapy training process, which was another reason that I chose to kind of use this as the framework for my training. And in fact, that type of training is often widely acknowledged within the sector to be useful and sometimes essential when you're holding a safe space for people having these very profound psychological experiences. Very important to be able to kind of create that safe space for people and make sure that that's competently held. And in fact, that probably explains the bias that there is in research trials currently and clinics where they are primarily looking for people to do this type of work who have a background as a therapist. So in my own background, I really found integrative therapy really useful as a framework. So I get asked many times by people, what's the best form of integration therapy? And like my response is, well, they all have some advantage to them. It depends on what the client needs, right? Different things will work for different people. So what you need are therapists who are able to work across different models and approaches in a way that is targeted to what the client's needs are at the time. So the definition of an integrative practice in this sense is you would work across a limited number of models, but you would have a systematic way of combining those different models together, versus a more eclectic approach, which is, well, you don't have any background theory of how those things fit together conceptually. You just purely work on the basis of what a client might need. And I'd say that there are kind of strengths and weaknesses with both of those approaches. I tend to prefer an integrative approach, and I think this is something that we should definitely focus on in psychedelic practitioner training courses, because the worst thing that can happen sometimes is that the therapist, because they only know one modality, they try to make the client's experiences fit that modality, or they are projecting on their own kind of belief system onto the client, which actually might be holding that client back in many respects. So with proper integrative practice, that is much less likely to happen because you're able to respond much more effectively to what the client's needs are. So that was the first reason for me kind of adopting this framework. The second is that it also means that if I build the training process out of existing frameworks for counseling and psychotherapy, it means that I can tie the training process to a national framework. And we've recently had one of these surface for counseling and psychotherapy, which is the Scope of Practice and Education, or Scope Ed, for counseling and psychotherapy. And this is specifically for adults. And it's been developed by 6 professional standards authorities, basically, and also their signatories. Now, on the one hand, that sounds great because it means that at the moment we've got a vacuum in psychedelic practitioner training. There's actually no commonly agreed standards. If we adopt these standards from counseling and psychotherapy, it means that we can tie the training, or at least ground it, in some kind of national standards framework. The downside is that this creates an additional problem, which is that the scope ed framework itself is incredibly contentious within the field, to say the least. It's quite discriminatory, so it's by no means a fully accepted framework. Also, when you look at the criteria and how that is actually broken down, so they break it down into 3 different categories of therapist: therapist A, B, and C. Therapist A is what they consider everybody to or should have as a kind of grounding as a therapist, and then B and C usually come with more practice and experience tailored to specific contexts. And it's really the kind of B and the C categories that are most in contention. The important thing to know is that none of those categories were actually created with reference to altered states of consciousness, and in particular, the competencies that would be required to work with psychedelic states. This is a huge problem because it means that if you want to kind of work as a therapist in this area and work as a psychedelic therapist, there are basically whole elements of the practitioner training which are not being articulated within any kind of common framework. So I think actually what would be really helpful would be for stakeholders in the kind of psychedelic space to be able to work collaboratively with each other to develop some maybe basic common standards for practice and education that would at least give us all a starting point at which to then base individual training on. That would be a huge undertaking and probably a lengthy one, but it would be good to see people actually starting to think about these issues now before we get things like psilocybin rescheduled and suddenly there's a huge demand for therapists. I'd also like to make the point that in isolation, counseling and psychotherapy is unlikely to cover the full range of practitioner competencies and knowledge that is necessary for supporting complex cases of psychedelic integration and also the facilitation of altered states through both sober and non-sober methods. There are also alternative frameworks that you could think about. So, for example, instead of using a counseling and psychotherapy framework, you could use a shamanic framework because you'll see comparable processes within those sorts of frameworks. So what I would like to see is moving to a kind of integrative model where maybe counseling is able to kind of incorporate shamanic work as part of the kind of framework. And that might get us some way to developing, on the one hand, a therapy training program that ties to some kind of basic structure, but also innovates, goes beyond the existing structure that we have in counseling and psychotherapy, which usually comprises of humanistic, so Gestalt, Carl Rogers' work on person-centered therapy, existentialism, and then you have like your CBT behavioral approaches and psychodynamic, which of course derives from Sigmund Freud's work. Those are the ones that tend to get used most often in therapist training programs. That's not sufficient for working with psychedelic states, particularly when people are encountering quite a lot of transpersonal states. So I think you need a much more diverse program of study. All right, so let's move now to looking then at some specific issues that I think are affecting the sector. So let's look at this one first, deficits in skill training. If you're a trainee on a counseling and psychotherapy course, you'll probably use case studies. And you'll do this as a way of kind of looking at how you apply specific approaches, theory in practice, also as a way of examining your own kind of self-reflective practice and various ethical dilemmas. That's fantastic. And you also see those things commonly being used within psychedelic practitioner training. However, therapist training programs also have something called skills practice, which take it from myself, who's gone through this process, takes time to acquire. So you start off kind of learning basic counseling skills, and over the course of a 3-year period, you gradually hone those skills, develop them more extensively. And this practice is often done in triads with 3 people. So you have a person and a client, or a speaker role, a person who's observing the process, and a person who is in the kind of client role. And these can be used to develop specific competencies, training competencies as a therapist. And whilst many psychedelic practitioner courses, as I say, use case studies, most of them, to my knowledge, do not use this type of skills-based training, which I think is actually essential to producing well-rounded people who are able to kind of hold a space competently. In fact, what you'll often get is that people will kind of just do the bulk of their skills training in 1 or 2 retreats at the end of the course. That is not sufficient for being able to kind of competently work with complex cases. And to give you a case in point, how many courses for psychedelic practitioner training probably actually role play somebody going through a difficult psychedelic experience in a way that allows the therapist to practice actually supporting somebody through such an experience? The first time you do that is not at retreat, working with people. The time to do that is through dedicated skills-based practice. How many therapist training programs, and I would actually say that they're also at fault with this, properly work with things like erotic transference? So when I was training therapists, one of the things I did was actually encourage people to role play hitting on each other as a client. And after that period, once those people are qualified, one of my students got back to me and said, you know, thank you very much for doing that, because I've just had that experience with a client. And if it hadn't been for having done that in skills training, I would have freaked out and not known how to work with it. The important thing is knowing that these things happen, particularly when it's a kind of intimate relationship, when you're working with somebody as a therapist, or also as a psychedelic practitioner. So these sorts of human things, boundaries, situations will arise, and it's really important to know how to navigate those safely so that you keep yourself safe and you keep the client or the person that you're working with safe. Because the worst thing that happens is that most people don't go into this field wanting to deliberately molest somebody or violate their boundaries. Most people in that situation have got to that situation because they've sleptwalked into that situation because they've not known or had inadequate training to be able to know how to navigate those sorts of feelings when they arise. And this is actually, I think, really important, that you can't also just assume that a fully qualified counselor or psychotherapist or coach would automatically be able to competently and quickly deploy their skills as a psychedelic practitioner without having gone through additional skills-based training. To give you an example, most therapists work to a 50-minute time window with a client. Depending on what substance you use as a psychedelic practitioner, you could be working with somebody from anywhere from about 3.5, 4 hours up to 12 hours plus, depending on what substance has been used. How many therapists do you think are actually used to being able to hold that frame of reference with a client for that period of time just off the fly? In my experience, there are some people who are naturals at that, but in my experience, most people need a period of time to train to be able to hold their attention for that period of time. I'm assuming most of you are probably familiar with the Karate Kid, right? Yeah, now bear with me with this, right? So we all know Mr. Miyagi's thing of wax on, wax off, right? Well, you can apply that type of approach to psychedelic practitioner training If you don't know how you're going to respond by keeping sustained attention with somebody for an extended period of time, go and do some exam invigilation work for a 3-4 hour period. If you struggle with that, you're probably in the wrong profession if you want to work as a psychedelic practitioner. So I think practitioners, even those who are fully qualified therapists, frequently underestimate the challenging nature of the work when they work as a psychedelic practitioner and the time required to hold space competently for clients. And this issue is further compounded, I think, by professional settings, particularly in clinics and private research enterprises, clinical research enterprises, where there is a tendency to rush people through the process, the training process, as quickly as possible so they can get them to the front line where they need them to be, right? I was in dialogue once with a organization which will remain nameless, who was interested in me maybe running a training process for them. And they said, well, how long does your training take? And I said, well, it took me 3 years to train as a therapist, and I'm still a novice. Right. We're kind of looking for a 4-month period, ideally, because we've got this clinical study coming up and we want people ready to go. And I said, you don't want to harm people, right? No, we don't want to harm people, but how quickly can you get people through? I didn't work with them because it's this sort of practice which is going to end up biting us in the backside. Because what we've got right now, and I'll say this at the kind of research level environments too, people who are working in a research environment are not practicing psychedelic assisted therapy in its full form. And they're not doing that because they're constrained by the research process, which means that if you were actually working as a therapist, you would have much more flexibility to be able to tailor the intervention to the needs of the person. You're very restricted in being able to do that in a research environment for obvious reasons. So the problem here is that we've got a bunch of people who are coming through the training process, either in private training processes connected to clinics or through the clinical research trials process, who are doing this sort of training, coming to the end of that process, and then some of those people are thinking, oh, well, I'm a psychedelic practitioner now, and maybe I'll take on private. Well, in my experience, most of that training is inadequate for the challenges that will face them in private practice. And the minute we get psilocybin rescheduled, which it will do eventually, is those people are going to be primarily supporting people. They haven't been trained adequately, in my opinion, to be able to competently work in that space across the range of situations and scenarios that are likely to face them in private practice. So we need to do better. Nowhere is this more apparent, I think, than when you consider that there's also a conspicuous lack of formally supervised placements. So when I trained as a therapist, I had to have, that had to be done under supervision, all my client work. I had to have a placement manager and a supervisor who would write reports based on how I work with clients. Those reports would go back to the placement provider, to the training provider. And if there was an issue with the way I was working, that would be able to be picked up and rectified. In most psychedelic practitioner training, there is either no structured clinical placement, or it's an informal process with no formal reports sent back to the training provider, which means that if there are issues, they're not readily being picked up. So what I would like to see is that actually in psychedelic practitioner training, we have proper structured placements for people. They could do that placement at a ketamine clinic. They could do their placement hours connected to a research trial. But for goodness sake, do it properly. and actually have proper placement reports, supervision around that, so that we know that the people coming through the process are adequately trained and skilled. So, for example, if you're just starting your journey and you want to train as a therapist and also as a psychedelic practitioner, when you start your kind of basic level, you could maybe start by doing things like just being an assistant within a psychedelic session. So you get used to doing things like assessment, for example, of what a person's needs might be, screening, those sorts of things. And over a period of time, you graduate to then becoming an assistant within a session. Then you start to get more involved with the integration work as your skills develop, and then you move on to facilitation. So if you do it in that kind of structured way, I think what you'll create is well-rounded practitioners who have had sufficient time to be able to fully develop and build out their skills and knowledge. Another big concern, I think, with psychedelic practitioner training is the over-reliance on online learning. There are, I'd say, probably most psychedelic practitioner training is offered online. There might be, if you're lucky, if you're fortunate, an opportunity to do maybe, in-person work at a retreat at the end of the training process. Now, I know, having trained therapists, that in order to meet national guidelines, 70% of the training process has to be done in person. If it's not, you're not considered to be trained adequately as a therapist. Why might that be? Well, I know for a fact that whilst online learning has many advantages, I use it myself in my own teaching, there are certain skills and ways of working with people that are best experienced in person, at least to start with, until you get competent in being able to do that. And then maybe with the right assessment, you can transition somebody to then maybe offering those sorts of services online. I'll give you an example. When you form a really close working relationship with somebody, there is a deeper resonance that happens between you and the person that you're working with. Sometimes you won't be consciously aware of it. You'll feel it in your body. And sometimes you feel that more strongly when you're actually in the same physical space as somebody. I'll say this to you. Who would you rather support you through an intense psychological experience if you've taken psychedelics? Somebody who's just done their training online, or somebody who knows what it's like to be in the room with somebody and feel all of those things and those resonances and being able to competently navigate that? I know which one I'd pick. So I think this is a huge problem for the sector. We have a whole range of people who are being, or who think they're being trained adequately, and actually they're exiting the training program probably severely under-resourced, because by the time they actually start doing this work in person with somebody, reality is really going to be a kicker. And to my knowledge, this is actually putting both the practitioner at risk and the client. So I think we need to kind of develop some common agreement and standard for this type of training, that if you are going to offer psychedelic practitioner training, we have a common agreement about how much of that training should be done in person, and just one or two occasions to participate in a retreat at the end of the course is not going to cut the mustard. So I think without this, it's difficult to see how actually we could really hope to deliver psychedelic therapies competently at scale, particularly through the NHS or even through the private sector or private market or through charities, because it might come a time in the future, and I certainly hope so, that charities might be able to subsidize some of the costs so that people can access aftercare and integration services or help with preparation. For example, we see this already in the counseling and psychotherapy sector. But to do that, charities will need certain things in place. They'll need some kind of accreditation scheme probably, and there are ways that one can do that. in a peer-based structure, which doesn't have to rely on hierarchy. But those are the sorts of things that we need to work towards building as a community if we are going to develop these sorts of interventions at scale. Now we come to another thorny issue, which is who recognizes the qualification that you do, right? So most of the training that counselors and psychotherapists do, often it's accredited to a particular governing body. Not all of it is, and that's not always a problem. But usually there is some kind of accreditation scheme that's done. We don't have anything like that for psychedelic practitioner training because we don't have any common standards. So I am actually working with a number of organizations right now to try to develop a kind of peer-based governing body that we could use as a community to accredit suitably quality training in this area. That would help to give employers, clinics, charities the confidence to be able to employ people with a certain qualification. The other thing is, what type of qualification are you actually studying? So in my case, I've decided to build the training out of a diploma structure. And I do that because diploma structure is a recognized framework with national standards to it. So for example, any diploma should basically tie to descriptors for levels 4 to 8 respectively. Those are nationally recognized standards. If we use that as a framework for doing psychedelic practitioner training, I think the training quality is going to be greatly increased. That also means that the qualification you get out of it will be recognized somewhere else, because currently the situation is, say you do your training with a particular place, the qualification is not recognized, it's not portable anywhere else. There's no guarantee that all the money you've spent on that qualification, that it's actually going to be recognized anywhere else than the place where you trained. That's bonkers. Why are people paying this extortionate amounts of money for training that could well be worthless? I don't know, I don't have the answer to that. So I think it's important that psychedelic practitioner training, we try to tie it to sector recognized educational standards. That also means how the course is accountable, because actually the accountability processes within a lot of the training is incredibly murky or non-existent. What's the complaints process, for example, on most courses if a student has a particular issue? How is that addressed? How is student feedback addressed? How can they demonstrate that they've listened to student feedback, changed the course in response to that? When I teach psychology for Cambridge, at the end of each module, students submit feedback. And some of that feedback can be fantastic and some of it can be quite cutting. And as course director, I have to address that. I have to speak to the academic director and say, okay, this is the feedback. This is how we're going to try to address it. And sometimes that means that certain things need to be tweaked. Where is that process transparently made in a lot of psychedelic practitioner training? I don't see it. So I think these are the sorts of things that will help to improve the quality going forward. And I've already kind of talked about accreditation processes. One of the downsides actually to the accreditation process is when I was thinking about my therapy training program, the immediate issue that I run into is, well, let's just say most of the governing bodies for counseling and psychotherapy are not too crash hot on psychedelic practitioners right now. They don't understand the practice. They probably feel quite threatened by it, at least the BACP does. That's my interpretation. The consequence is they don't recognize the training or the experience that people have in this domain. That also means that this is compounded by the ethical frameworks that they have, right? So all of the ethical frameworks that is used for standard counseling and psychotherapy prohibit people from working with substances unless those substances are considered to be psychiatric medications or medical drugs, effectively. Psychedelics are not considered in that way in the UK currently. So the downside to that is that every therapist working as a therapist in that capacity on a clinical trial is probably technically in contravention of their ethical framework, because all of their ethical frameworks are not suited and adapted for that circumstance. The only one that is attempting to do that is the ethical framework that I'm trying to develop with the Scottish Psychedelic Research Group in collaboration with the Independent Practitioners Network. It would be great for other people to get in and help with this, because I don't want to be running it all myself. And it kind of feels like that sometimes. But we need these things in place if we're going to develop and roll out these things competently. And I know that there are people in different parts of the country kind of doing bits and pieces around these things. We need to be working together much more and collaborating on this, because this should come from all of us. We all have a valid voice to add to this process. So I would like to see less things being siloed and more open kind of working in collaboration with these things. All right, so I think we talked a bit there, so that's probably a good place to kind of leave it and kind of have a discussion, probably a lively discussion, hopefully, around some of these issues. Thank you very much.
Right. Thanks a lot, John. That's very timely, I think, isn't it? You said with these drugs going to be licensed soon, and yeah, so I'm sure there's plenty of stimulated any questions. Any questions from the room to begin with? Please.
First of all, thanks. That was really, really interesting, and including the first part about your experience, your personal experience. My question is, okay, let's say I'm a health professional with no psychological or formal psychological training or therapeutic training or whatever. If I wanted to go down that path, taking into consideration what you said about the lack of, accreditation and all of that, what would be the most ethical and safe way to approach this? Would you consider like I should go kind of like studying like counseling first or something like that?
I think that would really depend on what type of practitioner you want to be. So I think if you want to be focused more on the kind of therapy side of things, then it would probably make sense to do some counseling or psychotherapy course, either one which you do that first and then you do the bolt-on practitioner training, good quality practitioner training afterwards, or you have a process like this where you train as a therapist and specialize in that area from the get-go, which to me makes the most sense. But it's also important to acknowledge that that's not the only route that you could go, right? So you could choose a shamanic framework, for example, if that was what was most interesting to you. You'll find comparable processes. They often have their own accreditation schemes and so on. So you really need to kind of look into that and see what course might be best for you. Important to know, though, that if you do that type of training, that will not be considered sufficient to then qualify you to work as a counselor or a psychotherapist. So at this juncture, you have to choose one pathway or another, whereas what I'm trying to do is actually introduce things like modules on shamanic counseling, for example, to give people the experience of using a different framework that is outside of the typical ones that tend to be used in counseling and psychotherapy. So I hope that kind of gives you some ideas.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Sorry I was late. I hope it wasn't too disruptive and being late, but I was actually listening to the beginning on Zoom and then came in. And so, yeah, thank you for the personal experience aspects and the confessional aspects of your talk as well. I was really intrigued by the Phelps paper you referenced briefly and the categories for a psychedelic therapist, the kind of qualities of mind they need to have, I guess you could call it, like the abiding presence, trust enhancement, spiritual intelligence, knowledge of physical and psychological of psychedelic effects, therapist self-awareness, ethical integrity, and proficiency in complementary techniques, those categories, because as a I have a background in theology, I'm now in anthropology and critical theory, but it reminded me a lot of, and it's interesting when you mentioned shamanism as well. My question regards whether chaplaincy has a role in this, because those categories that you listed in the Phelps listed in his paper remind me very directly of the categories for ordination that the Anglican Church have, but which are a little, like, really quite similar, alarmingly similar, I'd say. So, you know, you have this, you have to demonstrate a sense of call. Other people have to vouch for you. You need to have a quality of mind, leadership skills, but also a kind of, you have to demonstrate a prayer life. So like an evolving spiritual life, a regular life of prayer. And then there, you know, there are the particularly Christian or Anglican ones, which are like, you have to demonstrate a commitment to the community and the worship and things like that. But yeah, I mean, I'm working on a paper at the moment on psychedelic chaplaincy, and yeah, I mean, do you think what kind of, obviously they're overlapping, but do you think there are unique things which the field of chaplaincy can offer to this? And I mean, for example, in realms outside of the clinic, and yeah, I guess that's the question. Yeah.
Simple answer is yes. I think there's a good argument to be had for a kind of much broader range of psychospiritual approaches being articulated within this type of training. And actually, you do tend to see that with psychedelic practitioner training. Some of them are really good. It's not based in the UK, although you can be a UK-based person on it. Synthesis do that quite well, for example. In terms of chaplaincy, yes, I think I would love to see people with that background coming through these sorts of training processes. And in fact, it would be kind of cool to have a particular module of study for that, of what that process is like. Because I think the important thing is working in this area, whether you're a therapist or whether you're kind of more on the coaching side, is you're able to work with different approaches and not impose them on a particular person, allow them to discover the meaning for themselves and work with that, which means that as a practitioner, you have to be comfortable using different approaches, one of which could well be chaplaincy.
So I guess there's like there are different models of chaplaincy, and they come with various pros and cons and risks and strengths. I guess one of the strengths of chaplaincy generally, which maybe the field of, say, purely psychological care might sometimes lack in terms of its ethical boundaries, is that it can't be confessional. So I have a friend who works in that field, somewhere between social work and psychology, helping people who've had psychosis reintegrate back into society. And one of the people she was caring for had a psychosis very much contextualized in their Muslim faith. And this friend of mine, who is training to be a clinical psychologist, is Muslim, but she actually risked her job. Like, she risked being fired for even talking to this person about their mutual faith, right? And that's different to the other, I guess, the dark side, which would be imposing a particular theo-narrative while someone's in a vulnerable space. But it does allow for that kind of, which a psychologist maybe is not trained to be allowed to do, right? To talk about that stuff.
Well, I think it depends on the tutor and how good they are at kind of doing it. So when I think about how I taught classes for people, I would sometimes say to them, disclose that, you know, this is a framework that I use. But the important thing here is that we find a framework that works for you. That might not be this one. Because you're offering it as an idea, something to consider, play with for a while, and explore. So you can kind of approach it from that direction.
It's more consensual that way.
Yes, exactly. I think that's the way to do it. In terms of what you said about the different models of chaplaincy, yeah, so I think
Yeah, it's like the more exclusive, like there's the, you know, there's like the particularist, and then there's the more universalist, and then there's the relativist, or you know.
well,
Yeah.
I think, again, this is where you need to sit down and think very carefully about the learning objectives of the training, right? Because being a psychedelic practitioner is probably a lifetime enterprise, right? As it is for a therapist. I still regard myself as a novice, right? I'm learning lots of things, and I will continue to do that, hopefully, as time goes on. So within a training program, you can only fit so much in, right? So you really have to hone down and think, what's most important? What do I want students to get as a baseline, just to explore, to get them into the space competently? Where they take it from there is going to be up to them, right? So when it comes down to what you were saying, you need to think about, okay, what's the other modules on the course? How will that fit with a particular type of model of chaplaincy, for example? And if there is a particular area that it's not so strong on, that might be counterbalanced by other aspects in other modules which do provide that component. So I say that that is a good argument for developing a kind of integrative training program where you kind of compare and contrast the relative strengths and weaknesses of different approaches. So I think that's how I would approach it.
Thank you.
Christine, do you have a question?
Thank you for your talk. I found it really interesting, and you showed so beautifully the great tension that there is between, on the one hand, going all of it, and it's exactly what you're trying to do, to sort of square this specific thing that doesn't fit anywhere and is actually illegal, in with frameworks that allow, at least prepare access routes for the future, because you're not actually quite there yet, right?
That's correct.
It's still a balancing act with a lot of things being shoved over abroad, being sort of needing negotiation, and this ethics question I found particularly interesting. So how do you, so the on the ground, in-person training, the supervision of training, the sort of having, when you train, you usually go through the experience yourself as well, you know. Whereas, of course, this is exactly what can't happen here, at least not officially. And I do think there is a way in which the professional psychotherapy has suffered from the neutrality that is being imposed on counselors. That is actually, I mean, the often despised Sigmund Freud had his patients have dinner with the family, you know, and there are reasons and a way to move away from this, because there is something patronizing and maybe a bit sort of taking over too personal, that has risks with it in this. But there is, on the other hand, that's a bit that is missing, and that in this whole description and in the discussion following your talk is coming up. This is the missing bit, the actual relationship between people who can share experiences. And that might be a general problem with a lot of counselor training today, but certainly in the psychedelic space, it seems really weird if the counselor can't speak or has to pretend they don't know what the participant is going through, whilst we would very much, as you said, hope that they have lots of that experience. So do you see a way of squaring the circle, or are we just waiting for the law to change?
No, I think actually there's lots that we can do. So I'll just start with kind of like counseling right now. So when I teach counseling, I teach it very experientially. So when I was teaching students about psychosynthesis and Roberto Assagioli's, he created a spiritual psychology, effectively, for those who don't know much about his work. And you teach people about subpersonalities and so on, and that, you know, in most therapist training programs, if it is in there, it tends to be done in a quite a dry kind of academic sense. I taught it experientially because that's how Assagioli wanted it taught, right?
How do you spell the name?
Oh, I have dyslexia, so no chance.
Okay.
But I can kind of put it on the sheet for you. So I developed a guided visualization for students to actually experience, to meet a subpersonality and experience it basing their own embodied experience first. They got the theory a lot better after that. So that's just counseling. If you were gonna kind of do that for psychedelic practitioner training, which I think should be highly experiential in the way that you work with it, when it comes to working with altered states, of course, we can't legally give people psychedelics, but we can use other sober methods to generate altered states. So when I envisioned this training process, one of the things you learn to do throughout the course is how to do shamanic journeys as a way of kind of being able to building comfort and experience of working with different altered states, progress that to breath work as part of the actual training. And people use that as a way of doing their own deep work and self-reflection through the experience. So by the time they finish the training process, they've acquired quite a lot of experiential practice of what it's like to have certain altered states, albeit without the psychedelics. It also means that for those people where it would be considered appropriate, you could do a retreat in a legal country, for example. But I think the important thing is no student should feel obligated to do that, because I get that it's important for therapists doing or practitioners doing this work to have their own experience. That experience comes from sober methods as well as psychedelic states. Breathwork can still be as transformative as certain psychedelic states.
The breathwork would be a compulsory, not a voluntary element of the training?
No. So again, you'd have to do it on a, so one of the things you would encourage people to do, right, is to do a proper assessment of risk with people in order to maximize benefits, reduce the possibility of adverse events happening. There are certain types of breath work where it would be inappropriate for someone to do, particularly if they have certain heart conditions, for example. That also applies to students. So as students are learning about the assessment process, that also applies to them. So they choose a method that one is legal and secondly, that is safe for them to do. If it means that because of other conditions they might have, they are safest exploring altered states through shamanic journeying or guided visualizations, that's the primary modality that they will use. Other ones might use something different where it's considered safe enough for them to do that. Even people where certain types of breath work like Wim Hof might not be suitable, there are other types of breath work which might be quite suitable for them to do. So I think it's about having those range of options for people to gain the experiential practice, which I think is the most important thing. So that's how I would like to see it articulated.
Steve, sorry.
Well, hey, thanks a lot. I really appreciated everything you were saying, especially because I've done one of those courses and I did the retreat at the end with the facilitating. I got the impression that as things stand at the moment, it's almost like a two-tier with you. You've got like a scene which is almost like a sort of a well-being scene, and you have middle-class people with sporty trauma. Not there's anything wrong with that. Go away and have this thing start half a cross between a yoga retreat and rave. And absolutely nothing wrong with that. And they benefit, and fantastic. And it's definitely got its place in mental health, I think. And then there was maybe a more intense area. And that more intense area, I got the impression a lot of people on my course, by their own admission and humility, wouldn't work in that area. And I mean, what is that like? And is it something that you can see actually happening going forward? I suppose considering what else goes on in that end of what currently happens in psychiatric, and would that be difficult to find people to work there, or what do you think?
Depends on the individual, I think, and what you feel is right. I mean, even with therapists, there are certain things that, for various personal reasons, people will find it difficult to work with. Okay, so you will, in that sense, just work with clients without those particular issues, because that is a kind of red line for you for various reasons that you might struggle with. Like, for example, when I started my therapist training, I had serious doubts whether I could ever sit with somebody who had experienced rape, for example, because of my childhood trauma. What I learned through that process, because the therapy training was well held, well executed, meant that I felt supported. I developed my skills over time, got confidence in working, gradually in more intense environments. And now I'm fine working with that. Yes, there are some things you hear from clients that are the saddest things, but they're also the most sometimes beautiful things that I will see. Gosh, this person's had all of this adversity and they've come through this, and they are where they are. But it can be intense work. And the way I would describe it is, sometimes when you work with a really intense person, it's like traveling down whitewater rapids, trying to hang on to the sides, right? That's what it feels like sometimes. What matters in that case is how well you look after yourself. So your self-care is essential to this process. So if you are working with somebody who's really intense, for example, maybe take on a few less clients at the time in order to give yourself the time, the space to recuperate, if you're able to do that. You don't always have the option to do that in some work settings, for example. But the important thing is that you work within what you feel is your personal competency range. So if there are certain types of work that are just too much for you, don't do it. Choose another area that you do feel that you can manage. That might just be on the preparation, it might just be on integration, might not be facilitation, for example. So.
Yeah, so I mentioned if you're actually sort of setting it up to have, an intense experience. I mean, what do you do with sort of big guys and people who, might be difficult to control? I'm talking about anything from sort of just getting up and wanting to, move around to, maybe something more intense.
In my experience, these things come down to the quality of the agreement you form with somebody right at the beginning of the session.
Interesting.
Right? So when I work with clients, I have an agreement. I say agreement rather than contract, because an agreement means that you both signed up to it and equally feel responsible for it.
It's a difficult conversation, this.
Yes.
More difficult than you might think.
I can. So if you were able to contract with somebody about what the boundaries of the relationship are going to be, and they are clear, and you stick to those boundaries throughout, you have a better chance of then being able to keep things within those boundaries, even during some really intense things. And where this gets really challenging sometimes is around touch, particularly. So I remember once when I was teaching a class, a student was walking by and a board that was kind of like a whiteboard fell off the wall and nearly hit them. I rushed across the room and kind of moved them out of the way, and the board went poof. And I said, that is one of the few exceptions, I said, to non-consensual touch, I said, because of a point of safety. Right? So, but when you are working with a person in a non-ordinary state, you have to, before they've even gone near that state, talk about things like consensual touch, what would be acceptable. So if, for example, there's an emergency and you need to intervene for a point of safety, say a fire alarm or something like that goes off, you agree with that person, I might need to disturb you during your experience. Would it be acceptable for me to touch your hand, or how would you like me to alert you? Those sorts of things. If you have those considerations, I think you're on safer territory than suddenly just doing something afterwards where it can have unforeseen consequences.
Thanks a lot.
Is there a question online? So it's someone in the chat.
No, it's just somebody asking for your email.
I'm sure they can put that up on the thing.
I do it, but I'm afraid to have another one. It's that sort
That's right.
sorry, I'm glad people laughed and didn't groan. But you're internally groaning, so I'll try and keep it short.
I'm not, I
Sure.
can assure you, I'm enjoying this.
Yes. You don't know me yet. So, I was really intrigued by the erotic transference training that you mentioned. So hitting on each other as a practice to stay professional kind of thing. And I'm thinking about my limited historical knowledge, but I do know something about the kind of underground therapy, quasi cults / like groups of friends of therapists that would meet up in California and Mexico, like Salvador Roquette, etc. And I'm sure if they did that, it would just turn into an orgy, basically. So, like, there is this like super permissive polyamorous strain in the psychedelic space, and people can think that's for better, people can think that's for worse. Obviously, people can, some people are like, and obviously, like, the standard therapist ethics is like, just no, that's a no-go. But there is a subculture of therapy in the psychedelic space that is of a sexual nature as well, that includes sex within that. Not just sex therapy, but like shamanic priestess sex therapy. I think there's a place called Ista or something in Spain. And obviously in William Leonard Pickard's book, there are 2 examples, I don't know if you've read it, of what I would call sexorcism.
Yes.
And I actually brought that up with him at Breaking Convention last year because of trying to problematize it a bit. Obviously, even though he didn't wriggle out of it in this way, one way you could kind of justify its existence in the book is that that's in the context of friendship, not therapy. But this isn't really a question, but I'm just interested in that, like, you know what I mean, like that.
I got lots of questions.
That dynamic within the kind of liminal space between recreational psychedelia that you mentioned actually, and therapy, and whether that could like backfire, that kind of technique of hitting on each other as practice to not hit on each other.
Yeah. Possibly, yes, but
in certain circles, I mean, I don't mean
Yeah,
like, in the like more suited and booted professional, maybe British space where there are more bodies that, not bodies, it's the wrong word. You know what I mean? Like in countries, in different countries, in different circles, yeah.
Well, I think in thinking about the kind of issues you talked about there, I think if you're in a kind of therapy relationship, I think you do need very strong boundaries because of the inherent power dynamics that there are. Like, for example, most therapists will, if they're good therapists anyway, and the client agrees they're good therapists for them, they'll know the intimate details of that individual, right? Some really deep, dark stuff that they maybe have not even shared with their nearest and dearest in life, right? But that's not a two-way street. Most clients will only ever know their therapist on a fairly superficial level, right? Because any kind of personal disclosure has to be thought about very carefully. I do think that personal disclosure from the therapist has its place, can be very powerful, but only when it's done in a way that empowers the client. Otherwise, it becomes more about the therapist than it does about the client, right? So there are these inherent power dynamics within those sorts of relationships that are further complicated when intimate contact is also a factor within that, which is why it is usually the case that most ethical frameworks will say, if you're in that type of relationship, there is no intimate contact between you. It should not be the case. That's an easy boundary to maintain in the sense of it's clear. Everybody knows where they are. but it's also not very pragmatic in the sense that people form these attractions with each other. You can't choose who you fall in love
Right.
with, for example, right? Shit happens, right? So it's how you respond to that. So even if I'm working with a client and as someone who's heterosexual, I'll think, gosh, that's a really attractive lady that I'm working with today. That's natural to think that. You might even think I'm pretty hot. Probably not, but these things happen, right? The point is, do you act on that? Or do you just accept that that is something that happens? And if it becomes problematic, and this is where you should take that type of material to your supervisor or to your peer group and talk about it, saying, I'm working with this client, but I'm really struggling because I'm finding it hard to focus on what she's saying because I'm too busy thinking about undressing her or something along those lines, right? When it gets to that stage, then you need to really think about whether it's actually appropriate you carry on working with them because it's occluding your professional objectivity in that scenario, right? And sometimes have a peer group around you where you can safely talk about these things is really important because most therapists actually, they'd be lucky if they just have a supervisor that they see maybe once a month for an hour and a half or something, right? And they have to go through, their client's load. So with that, if you've got a peer group that you trust and you can kind of talk about these things, you can probably catch things before they become ethical transgressions more effectively, right? So that's one thing in a therapy context.
Yeah.
The thing that you're talking about is consent is important, right? If you're in a space with other people and it is a consensual arrangement that you have that intimate contact with each other, that's one thing, right? I mean, I would argue that that should never be the case within therapy. Even sex therapy should not include generally sexual contact because of the power dynamics and the imbalance that there is in that process. So in those kind of non-professional settings, or where you were talking about polyamory, for example, those are kind of valid settings for those people. And if they're all consenting to that, then there's no problem. The problem arises if somebody feels obligated to engage in that sort of behavior because of peer pressure, or they haven't consented to it and they're in an altered state and something happens. And we're all too aware of instances where that happens. And we do have to really think about this very carefully for this type of therapy because these things happen in therapy, in usual therapy practice and also in psychedelic practitioner work. So I think the kind of consent issue is really important to consider.
If I do agree that one can have a very meaningful relationship with one's therapist, but what if anything is going to kind of it's going to provide like the warmth and the intimacy? I mean, you can't even give them a cuddle. Because certainly when I was having my patient experience, it felt very cold.
Yeah.
And, won't say any more about it.
That's okay, and thank you for saying that. I think it depends on what type of model you use. So for example, if you're using a humanistic model, you're using Carl Rogers' model where you're using what he calls his core conditions. You can actually build, even with no physical contact, a very intimate, close relationship. And it is the case that sometimes in those experiences, those relationships, that might be the only occasion in that person's life where they've ever experienced that degree of close relationship. And it's natural that some people mistake that for love because they've never experienced anything like that in their life up until that point. So it's important, I think, for therapists in that sense not to abuse that situation for their own ends, because it is easy to do that. in certain circumstances. And there are unfortunately people who go into it for those reasons, but they are in a minority, and most people sleepwalk into that situation because they haven't prepared for it properly. But I would say that if you are a humanistic practitioner, you can build very strong, intimate relationships, and it takes different amounts of time for different people. Like if you were using a psychodynamic approach, there might be more of a tendency to be a bit more distant with the client, because Freud used that approach. But actually, most psychodynamic practitioners that I know these days still use the warmth and the empathy, those core conditions when they're working with people. So they've kind of become fairly universal, I'd say, these days.
It seems an awful shame that you can't go around and have dinner with your client's family, whereas the priest can or the GP can.
Well, again, it's there are kind of power dynamics within both sets of relationships, right? But as I said, you might know your priest fairly well. They might disclose elements of their life, talk about that. A therapist wouldn't necessarily.
Just a comment on this. I mean, you always say that, you've said this a lot now, the power dynamic, the power dynamic. There is a way in which, of course, the enforced distance, and I'm also enforces the power of the therapist, because they stay this blank projected surface, and actually withholding is a massive instrument of power. So you can read this, you know, you can say, yes, there is a huge problem with touching, and consent doesn't solve it. Because in a situation, a patient might well consent to something that a few weeks later appears to them absolutely abusive and wrong, and actually having harmed them. So the consent issue is really difficult, but also the power dynamic that comes from both wrongly engaging as well as keeping distant needs to be considered, you know, because that is making the power of the priest comes, I put it like this bluntly, sorry, from God. The power of the therapist comes from the therapist's demeanor. And so it is a construct that is carefully created and manicured. So I think that we need to look at this in all the complexity that there is.
I agree with that. I mean, for example, there are ways you can empower somebody even with the distance thing. So there's times when I've said to a client, how close would you like to sit? You can move the chair further away or closer. It's up to you. It's fine. They know the boundaries of the relationship. That I mean, it's not like I say explicitly, you know, there will never be any kind of sexual contact between us. But those processes are very carefully managed to make sure that that type of activity doesn't happen. But you can certainly give people freedom to choose how close they want to be to you in the session. And there might be times where I've had it with clients where they've come in and they're in a cardio-activated state and they've moved their chair right to the back of the room. And I'm okay with that. I'm okay with them moving the chair closer to me. It's up to them what they want to do. So I give them the power to decide that. That's one way that I do that.
I mean, therapist should be, you're joining someone as an equal human, ideally. And that sort of empower. I mean, I think when you say empowerment, it's not like the therapist is feeling they're more powerful, but the person's quite a vulnerable state if they're really sharing difficult things, aren't they? So there is, I don't know. So, and the therapist can't abuse that position, I suppose.
That's right. And also in terms of like physical touch, I don't have any problems with somebody shaking my hands. I mean, I've had a client say to me at the end of the therapy, can I give you a hug? I'm okay with that because they know the bounds. At that time, you know, we come to the end of the therapy session, and for some people, that's how they have closure, but it would never be any more than that. In fact, that's only happened once.
Wait, Mark, we just have one question.
One question.
Two actually, I think, over there, but I've also got one if we have time.
Well, we'll just take that question. It was from David. Can you read it up there? You see that?
I think there are two questions in the.
It was the chat before. The first bit they say, question one was, David's saying you're they got the impression that you were part of the study by David Nutt, and how would that have happened with your history of bipolar? But that wasn't the case, was it? No, that wasn't. The second question there is, what are your thoughts about offering psychedelic assisted therapy for people with a history of psychosis or manic symptoms? How can this be done safely?
I don't have the answers. I think it's something that we need to talk about and try to figure, and maybe through a process of trial and error to a certain extent, figure out what support people need to help them in those, navigate those things. I think probably most people could experience a psychedelic state if you have the capacity to provide whatever resources they need to help them navigate that. In the case of psychosis, that varies quite a lot between people. So I think I would be very cautious about at this stage, giving a one-size-fits-all solution. I think it will come down to the individual, what their particular needs are, how it manifests for them, and then talk about that and what factors you might discuss to kind of figure out how you mitigate some of the risk around that.
Possibly in a sort of residential setting, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah, and having the right support around you
Yeah.
to that would be critical, I think.
brilliant. Thanks a lot, John.
Really quick. You said something really fascinating about the BACP, if I
Yeah.
can quote you. And I'd like to unpack what you meant by that. So BACP doesn't recognize the domain of psychedelic therapy. And you use the phrase because they feel threatened by it.
Yeah.
And yeah, do you really think that there's like a kind of institutional threat because this is such an up and coming thing that old, more crystallized bodies are like, nah?
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
And I'll also, so I'll put it this way. Think about how psychedelics actually, how we think they work in the brain right now, right? So that what they do is they disrupt all of the kind of top-down information that we have. Our model of the world is disrupted, right? It prioritizes bottom-up processes. It liberates the cortex so that now it's under less control. It's able to free flow in a jazz-like way with lots of different ideas and so on, right? That's what's happening to our field right now, right? We are the bottom-up processes that are being liberated right now. And the BACP and all of those power structures are the kind of top-down thing, right? So that's why they're feeling threatened, because their world model is going to be destabilized by what we're doing.
It's a macrocosm.
That's right. Yeah.
Thank you very much. That's great, John.